They found the library empty at first glance, but the air hummed with heat, metallic and sweet, as if something invisible pressed against their skin. A single manuscript had vanished, yet the walls were etched with twisting cracks, shadows curling in corners, as if alive. Fingers traced stone and felt warmth. Whispers brushed ears, soft, deliberate, human and not human at once. The castle itself seemed to breathe, measuring, remembering, waiting. And somewhere, in the absence of pages and ink, a presence lingered, watching, patient, eternal. You thought a book could be destroyed. You were wrong. The first thing anyone noticed in the library was the whispering. Not a trick of wind rattling through broken windows, nor the shuffle of servants hurrying through darkened halls, but a sound that rose from the books themselves, subtle, persistent, as if the pages breathed with quiet intention. The shelves loomed like sentinels, their oak warped by centuries, polished smooth in some places and splintered in others, and the floor beneath hummed faintly, carrying vibrations through stone and timber that pricked at the bones. Candlelight shivered across the walls, casting shadows that were not content to remain still. They writhed, stretched thin cracks into labyrinths that seemed to pulse, suggesting a presence eager to probe outward, to escape its prison in silence. One manuscript rested on a pedestal at the center of the chamber, its cover darkened with age, almost black, the leather soft yet unnervingly supple, as though the surface had learned to yield under gentle pressure. Its pages lay open, curling at the edges with a dampness that was not moisture nor decay, but a warmth that radiated like the pulse of something living, pressing upward from within the parchment itself. The air carried the mingled scent of ink, iron, and a metallic tang that pricked the tongue and left a faint, lingering taste on the roof of the mouth, as if the very atmosphere conspired to remind intruders of the manuscript's unnatural vitality. Dust motes hovered lazily in the candlelight, drifting through faint drafts that seemed to emerge only to be swallowed again, and each movement stirred the whispering into murmurs that suggested deliberation, patterns, even curiosity. Along the walls, the cracks spidered outward in erratic yet unnervingly deliberate ways, widening imperceptibly, some deepening as if the stone itself were being tested, examined by fingers unseen, searching for a weakness or a seam that might allow the library to bend around the manuscript's hidden purpose. Books leaned slightly from their shelves, as if drawn toward the pedestal, their spines arching in silent supplication, and the air grew heavier with every passing moment, thickening near the manuscript, pressing against the skin with a faint, insistent weight. Candle flames flickered in unison, not from draft, but from proximity, elongating shadows along the floorboards that creaked and moaned under subtle pressures that no living footstep caused. The manuscript's pages trembled faintly, curling further at corners that no hand had touched, and when the candlelight hovered near, the edges seemed to soften, giving under invisible fingers, recoiling and stretching in ways that made the mind hesitate, questioning whether paper could truly possess the elasticity of flesh. The whispers intensified as the temperature in the chamber shifted almost imperceptibly, warm currents pooling near the pedestal and rising to brush the cheeks and hands of anyone who dared approach. There was no pattern to the sound, no recognizable rhythm, only the sense of intelligence lurking beneath the parchment, waiting, recording, adjusting to each movement, each breath, as if the manuscript itself were alive and aware. The deeper one ventured into the chamber, the more the air seemed to conspire against comprehension, thick with metallic perfume and the latent hum of long-forgotten energy, vibrating faintly through stone, through bone, through the marrow of the castle itself, until it was impossible to discern whether the library contained the book or the book contained the library, and whether the whispers were warning, invitation, or the beginning of something far older and infinitely more patient than time could measure. An aristocrat of the castle, obsessed with permanence, had poured his own essence into the book, and the act lingered in the walls like a pulse that refused to quiet. Blood mixed with glue soaked every page, the dark crimson curling into intricate veins across the parchment, winding around the loops of his handwriting until the lines themselves seemed to pulse with a rhythm all their own. Each stroke, each blot of ink carried intention, a whisper of the hand that had once wielded the quill, and it lingered, refusing to fade even as centuries passed. Time around the manuscript did not follow the ordinary cadence. It swelled and contracted unpredictably, a week dissolving into a single hour stretching into what felt like a month, the senses betraying reason and leaving the body unervingly aware of its own impermanence. Those who entered the library felt the temperature rise without warning, subtle at first, a lingering warmth crawling up their arms and pooling beneath the collar of their tunics, slicking their skin with sweat that smelled faintly of iron and wax. Heat rolled through the chamber like a slow tide, pressing against the ribs as though the book exhaled directly into veins, a gentle but insistent pulse that made each heartbeat feel measured, mirrored by something unseen. The walls shifted imperceptibly, stone grinding against stone in barely audible murmurs, releasing the metallic tang of age and iron into the air, a warning or perhaps an invitation, no one could tell which. Every surface seemed to respond, the shelves leaning just slightly toward the pedestal, as if eager to bear witness, the floorboards creaking under imagined pressure, the cracks along the walls lengthening and deepening without visible cause. Candles shivered in their sconces, their flames stretching toward the manuscript, bending unnaturally as though drawn by some invisible gravity. The air grew thick, scented with ink and iron, with something sweet and clinging, as if centuries of concentrated essence had saturated every corner of the room. Dust motes swirled in the trembling candlelight, drifting in currents unseen, sometimes gathering over the manuscript like hesitant sentinels, sometimes scattering as though repelled by a subtle force. The book responded to proximity. Approaching it, hands trembling and reluctant, brought immediate changes. The temperature beneath the fingers rose, the parchment pliant, almost soft to the touch, yielding in ways that made the mind recoil even as curiosity demanded further contact. Pages flexed like muscle, curling and uncurling, sometimes brushing the skin with a damp, deliberate touch. The aristocrat's handwriting seemed to twitch and shift under inspection, lines of ink flowing ever so slightly, forming loops and spirals that had not existed before, as though the manuscript were rewriting itself in slow, careful increments. Each alteration carried intention, subtle but undeniable, like the recording of memory rather than the random wanderings of ink. The warmth grew steadily, pooling at the edges of the pedestal, rising through the floorboards, climbing along the legs of those who lingered, pressing a silent claim upon them, whispering in sensations rather than words, a quiet insistence that left the lungs tight and the stomach uneasy. Hours passed unnoticed, though the mind insisted they were minutes, the senses bending to the manuscript's will. Shadows along the walls lengthened and shivered, cracking stone and mortar as they stretched, forming jagged lines that seemed to reach toward the book, fissures deepening imperceptibly, carrying the faintest vibration through the marrow of the castle itself. Shelves moaned under their own weight, leaning slightly as if to offer proximity to the book, to bear witness more closely to the presence contained within its pages. Each time the manuscript shifted, the air trembled. Each time a finger traced the parchment, heat pooled and spread unpredictably, a liquid warmth that crept across skin, threading through veins with the subtle patience of centuries. The book did not merely resist time, it manipulated it, bending hours and days into a rhythm entirely its own, a cadence that left the body tense with anticipation, the mind unmoored from rational measurement. Objects left on tables or pushed carelessly to the side would return to their original positions overnight, the displacement subtle enough to provoke doubt in those who observed. Candles, once snuffed, sometimes rekindled in the morning with a thin blue flame, hovering just above the wick before settling into normality, as though the air itself were remembering the light it had carried. The scent of iron and ink remained heavy, embedding itself into hair and skin, lingering long after departure, creating a persistent, low-level anxiety that preyed upon memory and imagination alike. Walls that had once been silent now creaked with low groans, a chorus of stone and mortar responding to the hidden presence, a slow, deliberate music of endurance and observation. Those who lingered too long reported subtle movements in their peripheral vision, shadows that moved independently of candlelight, reflections in polished wood that delayed fractionally, as though the castle itself were adjusting to the presence of the manuscript, accounting for intruders in ways invisible yet ineffably precise. The aristocrat's act had anchored more than his essence. It had anchored attention, desire, vigilance. The manuscript measured its world with patience, mapping intruders' movements as if cataloging the responses of flesh and will. Each page, each stain of blood, each loop of ink was a test, a calibration, and the library bent and shifted in response. Floorboards flexed, shelves leaned, the air grew warmer and thicker, while walls stretched cracks toward the pedestal as though they were conduits, channels along which the energy of the book could flow. The chamber itself seemed to breathe in tandem with the manuscript, expanding and contracting with a rhythm felt rather than heard, subtle enough to be missed yet insistent in its presence. Even candlelight responded, flames tilting, elongating, contracting in perfect, deliberate accord. As hours bled into one another, the line between observer and observed dissolved. Every sensation, from the warmth of the air to the slickness of sweat, every flicker of shadow and shiver of stone, bore the imprint of the manuscript's attention. The book did not need eyes. It measured, tested, and endured through subtle influence, a patient, calculated presence that left nothing untouched. By the time dawn threatened to intrude through narrow windows, the chamber had become a crucible, a place where time, space, and perception folded inward, leaving only the manuscript at the center, patient, aware, eternal, waiting for the next hand to trace its pages and submit to its quiet, inexorable will. At midnight, the library became a place apart from time, a chamber where shadows gathered and thickened, where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The book moved then, no longer a passive artifact of obsession but an agent of intent, its pages turning with a wet, deliberate sound that resonated through the stone and timber of the castle. Each sheet unfurled as though curling fingers of paper tested the air, stretching, recoiling, brushing against the pedestal with a moisture that was neither dew nor decay, a substance that hinted at life. The sketches of the aristocrat within the margins shifted under the faint light, his face elongating, muscles tightening in the ink until the eyes glinted with a faint awareness, a spark of recognition that unnerved even the most practiced observer. The warmth that emanated from the manuscript pooled into the palms of those who dared touch it, seeping into veins as if the parchment itself were breathing, each page pliant and soft as skin, elastic under the press of fingers, leaving prints that vanished only to reappear hours later in places no hand had touched. The room responded to the book's awakening. Cracks along the walls deepened and multiplied, jagged lines snaking toward the ceiling in irregular patterns, as though the stone itself recoiled from the manuscript's influence. The shelves, lined with tomes and manuscripts long forgotten, shifted subtly, leaning inward, bowing toward the pedestal as if drawn by an invisible weight, the bindings creaking under pressures no eye could see. Candlelight flickered violently, shadows slashing across the walls in jagged motions that did not correspond with the flame, twisting, turning, coiling along the cracks like living smoke. The air grew thick, metallic, and sweetly pungent, wrapping around the throat and nostrils with a texture both repelling and magnetic. Dust hung heavy in the beams of candlelight, moving in currents unseen, gathering into small, floating whirlwinds above the manuscript, then dissolving as if repelled by an unseen hand. Anyone who lingered in the room felt the subtle pressure of attention, a force pressing against the chest, the back, the skull, and threading into the marrow of their bones. The manuscript's pages were no longer inert. They flexed under scrutiny, curling as if to hide, and unrolling as if to reveal secrets only the most daring might witness. Words and sketches pulsed faintly, veins of ink shifting, curling into new patterns, recombining to form subtle alterations that suggested calculation rather than randomness. Each page exhaled warmth, pooling at the edges of the pedestal and rising through the floorboards in quiet currents that pressed against the feet, pulling lightly, insistently, as if measuring resistance. The parchment smelled faintly of blood, iron, and something older and unplaceable, a scent that clung to the tongue, to the throat, and persisted in memory long after departure. The aristocrat's presence, so meticulously infused into the book, seemed to awaken fully in those hours when the castle slept. The sketches smiled faintly, the eyes glinting, the hands reaching for margins as if to grasp, to measure, to learn. The tactile response of the parchment grew more insistent. When fingers pressed against a page, it yielded, rebounded, pressed back with subtle resistance, and then conformed, leaving impressions that did not fade but traveled across the text to other sections, migrating as though the manuscript itself were alive, tracking movement, mapping touch, asserting dominion over any who approached. Candle flames bent toward the manuscript in unison, stretching tall and thin, then snapping low, a choreography imposed upon fire itself, responding to the pull of attention emanating from the pedestal. The cracks along the walls continued their slow, deliberate expansion, veins of stone widening and lengthening, forming a web that arched toward the ceiling, toward the rafters, toward points of structural tension, as if the building itself were rearranging to accommodate or resist the presence within the manuscript. The floorboards flexed beneath careful weight, groaning in muted tones that traveled through the foundation, a symphony of pressure and patience. Books along the shelves sometimes tilted, bindings stretching or compressing subtly, leaves rustling in response to the manuscript's activity, forming a chorus of sound that spoke of awareness, of attention, of calculation. The warmth intensified near the hands of those who lingered, a slow seep into bone and muscle, a sensation that felt like an intimate observation, pressing in ways the mind could barely name. The manuscript pulsed under touch, soft and yielding, yet insistent, elastic and resistant, carrying the sensation of life folded into paper. Each page, each vein of blood and ink, seemed to communicate silently, a network of sensation and attention that measured the room, the presence, the potential threat of those who dared intrude. By the third hour after midnight, the library itself seemed to have surrendered to the manuscript. Shadows pooled and stretched unnaturally, the cracks along the walls forming a lattice that hinted at intention, and the shelves leaned inward in silent observance. Dust stirred without cause, drifting in thin ribbons that aligned with the motion of the pages. The air was thick, warm, metallic, and charged, carrying the smell of iron, ink, and old, coagulated blood. The manuscript's pages continued their wet, deliberate motion, curling and uncurling, brushing surfaces, pressing lightly against those who approached, leaving impressions and warmth that lingered, a reminder that contact was measured, recorded, and catalogued in ways the mind could not comprehend. As dawn approached, the movement slowed but did not cease. Pages settled only partially, leaving edges raised, curling, poised for the next hour of influence. Shadows recoiled into corners but remained alive, breathing with the room. The cracks in the walls had deepened, forming an invisible lattice connecting floor, pedestal, and ceiling, as though the stone itself had memorized the manuscript's position, its weight, its influence. The aristocrat's presence pulsed faintly in the ink, a subtle insistence beneath every tactile and visual sensation, a latent intelligence waiting for darkness to return, for candlelight to quiver, for hands to trace the pages again, and the library remained patient, alive, and impossibly aware, a chamber suspended between night and eternity, trembling with intent. Attempts to destroy the manuscript proved futile, each act of defiance against its presence only deepening the library's awareness. Fire blackened one edge, a furious, consuming blaze licking along the ink and blood, curling the pages in grotesque contortions, yet by dawn the damage had reversed itself. The burned edge softened overnight, curling back into place, the ink returning to its original darkness, and the blood swelling and pooling again with a wet sheen that caught candlelight in a manner entirely unnatural. Scholars sent from distant towns, men and women whose reputations rested on reason and method, documented each failure with fevered precision. They wrote in leather-bound tomes, ink smudging under trembling hands as candles burned low to the base, heat pooling unnaturally around their fingers, and yet each observation seemed to feed the manuscript, adding another layer to its awareness. Every page resisted erasure. Every smear of blood throbbed with a patient, deliberate intent, as though the aristocrat's essence still measured the world through veins of ink and coagulated fluid. The texture of the parchment shifted beneath hands, softening when pressed, hardening when ignored, elastic and wet as if responsive to subtle, unseen commands. The library responded with a life of its own. Shelves leaned slightly toward the manuscript, warped over decades, yet now moving subtly, tilting on axes imperceptible to ordinary observation. Floors sagged under their own weight, wooden planks shifting in creaks and groans that traveled up the walls, low vibrations threading through beams like pulses of attention. A subtle hum filled the space, low, resonant, rising and falling without discernible pattern, synchronizing with the approach of intruders, with the heat of their bodies, with the rhythm of breath and blood. Stones seemed to breathe, small grains shifting in their joints, walls flexing along existing fissures, deepening cracks along the arches as if the masonry itself recoiled from the manuscript's influence. Candle flames flickered with deliberate caprice, stretching towards certain shelves, bowing over open pages, then snapping low, as if the fire had become a nervous participant in the library's awareness. The metallic scent of blood and ink filled every corner, clinging to skin and hair, settling into the lungs with a quiet insistence that left a lingering taste long after withdrawal. Attempts at wetting the pages with water, acid, or alcohol failed just as dramatically. The liquid spread across the parchment in slow, creeping waves, pooling along the veins of ink and coagulated blood, but no absorption occurred. Instead, the manuscript seemed to integrate the substance, twisting it into the texture of the page, leaving the touch of moisture permanently recorded. Pages warped and unwarped, curling at corners only to flatten again, flickering with heat that had no discernible source, rising in waves that pressed into the hands of those who dared touch them. The sketches of the aristocrat in the margins seemed to watch each intervention with patient intelligence, the eyes following motion, glinting faintly as though delighted by both caution and boldness. Every action against the manuscript generated subtle, almost imperceptible changes in the chamber. Shadows lengthened, floorboards flexed in time with the intruder's heartbeat, and the low hum rose slightly in pitch as though approving or marking the attempt. Some scholars attempted to confine the manuscript, wrapping it in lead sheets, encasing it in locked chests, burying it under stone, yet the manuscript's influence infiltrated every container. The lead, cold and rigid, warmed overnight, shifting minutely under pressure, lines of the binding compressing, allowing the pages to settle back into position. Locked chests were found ajar the following morning, fastenings altered without human interference, the book resting precisely where it had been placed but subtly shifted, edges curling in satisfaction. Stones laid atop it for weight shifted, forming tiny depressions where none should have existed, and air currents carried warmth in deliberate currents that suggested a patience measured in decades rather than hours. Even attempts to remove the manuscript from the castle were thwarted. When scholars tried to transport it, the pages curled toward them, the manuscript exhaling warmth and tension into the hands of the carriers, forcing them to hesitate, sweat pooling in their palms, fear pressing into the marrow. Every movement of the book reinforced awareness, mapping intention, cataloging resistance, recording human interaction in ways that defied the limits of perception. By the third week of observation, the library itself had transformed into a chamber whose architecture bent subtly in response to the manuscript. Walls stretched along cracks that deepened with each day, forming jagged lattices that ran from floor to ceiling, aligning with the pedestal, the placement of shelves, the positions of intruders. The wooden beams of the ceiling flexed minutely, moving with a slow, patient rhythm, echoes of stress traveling along the lengths of timber in soundless waves. Candlelight behaved unpredictably, flickering in places where no air moved, stretching shadows into impossible angles, curling corners into false perspectives that disoriented those unaccustomed to the library's subtleties. The metallic scent of iron and the sweet tang of blood intensified, pooling in corners and lingering around the pedestal, saturating the air in a dense, almost viscous manner. Even the dust behaved in ways impossible to explain, gathering into floating whirls over the manuscript before dispersing, leaving trails that hinted at intelligence, awareness, and deliberation. No scholar who observed the manuscript remained untouched by the experience. Hands grew clammy from persistent warmth. Sleep was fitful and filled with dreams of paper curling into fingers, of walls bending and cracking to reveal endless layers of observation. The manuscript's presence became a slow, inescapable gravity, pulling attention and perception toward it, drawing subtle shivers through bones and spine. It measured, catalogued, and responded in silence, maintaining a patience that was both endless and unyielding, ensuring that no act of aggression, no experiment of fire or acid or weight, went unnoticed or unrecorded. The castle itself had become a part of the manuscript's influence, a participant in the act of endurance, shifting in silent concert to reinforce the presence at the pedestal, flexing stone and timber in quiet obedience to the intentions embedded in ink and blood centuries before. By the time the fourth week of observation began, it was impossible to claim mastery over the manuscript. Fire, water, acid, lead, stone, even human hands, all failed against it. The air pulsed with anticipation, the chamber alive with the subtle, unrelenting force of patience, attention, and preserved obsession. Each failure was recorded in detail, yet every recording seemed only to feed the manuscript, deepen its awareness, and extend its reach. The library had become a crucible, a living instrument tuned to the persistence of one man's obsession, a chamber where architecture, shadow, scent, warmth, and sensation combined to enforce the manuscript's quiet dominion. And in that dominion, the aristocrat's essence pulsed within ink and blood, patient, intelligent, and unyielding, watching, measuring, enduring, waiting for the next touch, the next attempt, the next hand to trace the pages and be claimed by centuries of deliberate, unbroken attention. One night, the book opened itself fully, and the warmth surged outward in waves, rolling through the corridors like a tide, pressing against doors, settling into the stone and timber of the castle with a deliberate persistence that made the air itself feel liquid. The cracks in the walls deepened and converged on the pedestal, veins of stone curling toward one another, subtle shudders traveling along the masonry, as if the castle were aware of the manuscript's awakening. Floorboards flexed under pressure, groaning faintly in rhythms that no human could measure, echoing through the hallways in low, resonant pulses that carried a sensation of observation, of attention focused and unyielding. The shelves leaned inward, old tomes rattling against one another as though stirred by invisible fingers, spines creaking in protest, while dust swirled in faint eddies over the pages of the manuscript, suspended and shimmering in the candlelight. The scent of ink and metallic blood thickened into a tangible presence, sweet and sharp, coating the tongue, clinging to nostrils, saturating the space with the insistence of life folded into parchment. The manuscript itself pulsed with a vitality that was impossible to define. Ink and blood writhed along the pages, forming subtle patterns that shifted with imperceptible intelligence. Faces emerged from the substance, not drawn but grown, forming and dissolving in the margins, their eyes glinting faintly as if aware of the presence of those who observed. The aristocrat's handprints pressed wet and pliant into the parchment, smearing across the lines of text and reappearing elsewhere, migrating in slow, purposeful motions, curling around letters and illustrations as though the book sought to communicate in gestures beyond words. The warmth radiated from the pages, pooling into the palms of anyone who dared approach, slipping along their wrists, up their arms, threading into muscles and sinew until it seemed the manuscript was drawing life from proximity, inhaling attention and exhaling pressure in equal measure. The castle responded to the manuscript's awakening. Cracks along the walls stretched and flexed, forming an intricate lattice that arched toward the ceiling, connecting floor to roof in subtle, jagged lines. Timber beams groaned under imperceptible shifts, the vibrations traveling through stone and wood, carrying with them a sensation of intent, a quiet insistence that the room was aware of every movement, every breath. Candle flames bent toward the book, elongating, snapping low, stretching into angles impossible to account for by wind or draft, shadows twisting in unnatural coils that crept along the walls, climbing the fissures, pooling in corners as if gathering intelligence. The air itself seemed to thicken, resisting movement, making steps uncertain, forcing the body to adjust to an invisible presence that pressed against skin and bone alike. Those who had observed the manuscript for weeks felt the effects inescapably. Heartbeats accelerated in resonance with the subtle pulses of the library, each breath drawn feeling thick and deliberate, carrying the metallic tang of blood and the warmth of ink into the lungs. Fingers that brushed the pages left prints that would vanish only to reappear elsewhere, migrating across lines and margins as though the manuscript were tracing a map, recording interaction, cataloging touch. Even the sound of footsteps on the wooden floors seemed amplified, stretched into whispers that traveled to the ceiling, then returned in faint echoes that suggested observation, measurement, and patient judgment. The manuscript pulsed again, wet and pliant, pressing upward against the pedestal, curling pages toward the edges of the room in a slow, deliberate motion, testing the boundaries of space itself. Faces formed more insistently in the margins, sketching themselves from ink and blood, emerging in three-dimensional relief from the pages, pressing forward as though breathing from the parchment. Eyes glimmered faintly, aware, assessing, reaching in ways the mind struggled to comprehend. Each page seemed to exhale warmth directly into the air, pooling beneath the pedestal, seeping through cracks in the floor, saturating walls with the metallic sweet scent of concentrated life. The aristocrat's handprints shifted, curling fingers seeking a surface, pressing against invisible planes, leaving wet impressions on empty air as well as parchment, evidence of intent made flesh within the manuscript's obsession. The library itself had become a participant, an extension of the manuscript's will. The cracks in the stone aligned with the pages, the beams flexed in anticipation of motion, floorboards sagged with deliberate rhythm, and candle flames moved in synchronized choreography. Shadows pooled along the walls, stretching unnaturally, coiling into patterns that suggested cognition, patience, and a subtle calculation of space. Dust hung suspended, forming transient whirls that followed the manuscript's shifting pages, dissolving only to reappear elsewhere in precise correspondence to the movement of ink and blood. Every element of the room obeyed a logic beyond human perception, a quiet symphony of responsiveness centered upon the open manuscript. By the third hour after midnight, the book's activity had reached a crescendo. Pages curled fully outward, pressing gently against the pedestal, brushing the edges of walls, flexing upward against the shadows. The aristocrat's face, now fully rendered in shifting lines of ink and blood, seemed to smile faintly, eyes glinting as if in recognition of the night, the observers, the chamber itself. Warmth radiated outward with intensity, pooling beneath floorboards, traveling through stone, threading into timber, saturating the air so that every inhalation carried sensation, pressure, and the faint, intimate weight of awareness. The library was silent then, every creak, every groan, every whispering curl of pages suspended in attention, holding its breath in reverent, terrifying observation. No one present dared move or speak. The manuscript's hands reached out from ink and blood, pressing, flexing, migrating across pages, curling toward corners, probing for the edges of the room, while shadows twisted along cracks in the walls, aligning with the motion, reinforcing intent. The warmth, the pressure, the metallic sweet scent, the subtle vibration of floor and timber, all coalesced into a presence that was patient, deliberate, and unrelenting. The library itself had become a living instrument, conducting a symphony of sensation around the manuscript, attuned entirely to the desires of one aristocrat, preserved in blood, ink, and the deliberate patience of centuries. When the night receded and the first pale light of dawn filtered through high windows, the manuscript settled only partially, pages curling faintly, handprints still pliant, shadows lingering in corners, dust still suspended in ethereal swirls. The cracks in the walls remained, deeper, more deliberate, forming a lattice connecting pedestal, floor, and ceiling. The warmth receded slightly but persisted in subtle currents, threading through stone and timber, promising return, insisting attention, reminding all present that the manuscript's will was unbroken, patient, and eternal, and that the library, its walls, its beams, and its shadows had become willing participants in a centuries-old task that could not be abandoned, restrained, or denied. The book vanished, not stolen, not burned, not hidden in any corner of the library, and yet the pedestal where it had rested for centuries lay empty, polished smooth by time and absence, the pages gone without a trace, parchment vanished as if it had never existed. The walls bore the evidence of its passage, thin, twisting cracks that ran from floor to ceiling, branching in unpredictable angles, curling and spiraling like veins beneath the stone, a subtle lattice of memory etched into the masonry itself. Shadows pooled in corners that once held shelves, stretching unnaturally, bending around angles and gaps, forming shapes that shifted when unobserved, lingering at the edge of vision with a persistence that made the mind strain and the stomach tighten. Heat radiated faintly from the floor and walls, a residual warmth that hummed beneath the palms of anyone who dared touch the stone, gentle yet insistent, pressing against the flesh in a way that suggested intent, memory, and patience. The metallic sweet scent of blood and ink, subtle but undeniable, hung in the air, clinging to the nose, settling in the throat, leaving a lingering trace that was almost tangible, a reminder that something had been and still was, despite the absence of physical form. The library itself seemed aware of the loss, as though it mourned or perhaps anticipated. The beams of the ceiling groaned under a weight that no human could measure, flexing minutely, sending low vibrations along the floorboards, through the stone, a subtle pulse that travelers described later as the heartbeat of the castle itself. Dust hung in the air, suspended in faint swirls that twisted against the light, tracing invisible lines along cracks and corners, only to vanish before anyone could track their pattern, reforming elsewhere with deliberate, intelligent irregularity. The smell of warmed ink and coagulated blood persisted, more ghost than substance, saturating the air with a sensation that was not easily dismissed. Those who had entered the library felt it in their hands, the subtle flecks of warmth beneath fingertips, as if the absent book had left a fragment of itself behind, a residue of awareness that pressed gently, insistently, against human touch. In the hours after dawn, the castle seemed to shift with a quiet deliberation. Shadows moved without source, stretching along the walls, curving around corners, converging on the pedestal before scattering unpredictably. Light from high windows was warped, diffused into subtle patterns that suggested movement, while stone and timber responded with imperceptible creaks and groans, forming a dialogue between structure and absence. The lattice of cracks expanded, curling along walls, across floors, arching towards ceilings in a network that mirrored the past activity of the manuscript, echoing the deliberate expansion of influence it had once exerted on the library. Candles, placed carefully by later visitors, burned low without wind or draft, flames bending toward corners where no illumination should reach, shadows swelling to fill niches and empty shelves with shapes that seemed almost sentient, writhing in a slow, patient motion that made the observer's eyes ache. Those who returned years later spoke of sensations impossible to describe fully. Hands pressed to stone felt the warmth as though the manuscript were recalling the touch of centuries past, a faint vibration under the fingertips that was neither pulse nor tremor, but deliberate and knowing. Some claimed to hear whispers, soft and constant, silk-like on the ear, yet sharp enough to prick the mind with fragments of words, phrases, and laughter that could not have been human, carried by air that remained utterly still. Travelers who lingered too long reported glimpses of parchment flickering in peripheral vision, warm and pliant, curling and uncurling before vanishing, leaving the imagination to supply the shape and weight of what was no longer present. The cracks in the walls continued to spread, tiny lines branching and intersecting in ways that suggested maps or diagrams, pathways that might lead to understanding, or perhaps only to madness. By the time decades passed, the castle had become legend, abandoned to wind and rain, yet still alive with traces of the manuscript's will. Visitors spoke of encountering pages in darkness, warm and pliant, choosing their reader, appearing only in shadows, curling gently under a finger as though testing resolve. The air in rooms long empty carried the faint tang of ink and blood, registering on the skin of those who crossed thresholds, lingering in lungs and hair, making sleep restless and dreams vivid with curling pages and hands that pressed wetly against invisible surfaces. Some emerged shaken, clutching the air, their fingers smelling faintly of metal and warmth, convinced that the manuscript had tested them, allowed them glimpses of permanence, yet demanded the unspoken price of attention, patience, and a fragment of the soul itself. The pedestal remained, polished by absence, the lattice of cracks continuing to extend in patterns no human could map. Shadows seemed to gather at its base, curling like fingers of smoke, twisting in ways that suggested cognition, waiting for interaction. Air currents carried faint, almost imperceptible heat, and the walls seemed to breathe, contracting subtly in rhythm with the observer's presence, as though the library itself had absorbed the book's essence and continued its work silently, deliberately, patiently. Travelers and scholars reported glimpses of faint impressions in the stone, as if wet hands had pressed against the surface, leaving prints that hardened into the masonry only to vanish again when viewed directly. Footsteps were echoed, not in sound, but in vibration, a subtle acknowledgement that the castle remembered every visitor, catalogued every motion, and responded in kind. Even centuries later, the castle's reputation endured. Stories spoke of a manuscript that chose who could read it, appearing only in darkness, warm and pliant, offering permanence at a cost no soul could survive. Visitors reported encounters that left hands trembling, hearts racing, the mind unsure of reality, compelled to leave yet unable to resist the subtle tug of attention, warmth, and expectation. The cracks in the walls, ever spreading, hinted at a persistent, patient presence, a force that had once occupied parchment and ink, now residing in stone and shadow, invisible yet undeniably aware. Whispers lingered in air thick with metallic sweetness, curling around beams, floating in corners, brushing the skin of the living, insisting upon recognition and compliance, and promising a form of eternity that was no longer written in ink or blood but breathed quietly, deliberately, through the castle itself. The book's disappearance did not signify absence but transformation. It had ceased to exist in form yet persisted in effect, reshaping perception, altering space, embedding awareness into the very architecture, the stones, the shadows, and the air. Those who lingered sensed it in their bones, in the warmth that pulsed faintly through the floor, in the metallic tang lingering on the tongue, in the whispering of pages that no longer existed but still turned. The manuscript had become the castle, and the castle had become the manuscript, eternal and patient, observing the living, choosing the curious, promising permanence at a price that no soul could endure fully, and offering the faintest, most terrifying reminder that absence is never empty, and some presences outlive their pages.